Welcome once again to a chilling journey through the darkest corners of humanity. From the shadows of history, we will delve into the minds of the most prolific and disturbing murderers who have ever existed. Monsters who lost their humanity to satisfy their darkest dreams. Number 8. John Wayne Gacy was an American serial killer known as the Killer Clown due to his occasional work as a clown at children's events. He was born on March 17, 1942 in Chicago, Illinois, and became a sinister figure who terrorized the community for several years. Gacy carried out his crimes between 1972 and 1978. During this period, he murdered at least 33 young men and teenagers. His modus operandi consisted of seducing his victims with the promise of employment, money, or sexual favors. Once he lured them to his home, he would subject them to extreme violence and strangle them to death. Some of the bodies were buried in the basement of their home, while others were dumped in a nearby river. Gacy's evil is evident in the brutality of his crimes and his apparent lack of remorse. Many of his victims were subjected to torture and sexual abuse before being murdered. Gacy showed a particular preference for young men, often teenage employees or young homosexuals who were more vulnerable and less likely to be reported missing. In addition to his atrocities, Gacy was also known for his disturbing fetishes. Dressing as a clown allowed him to gain the trust of his victims and hide his true nature. He was also fond of taking photographs with his victims in lewd poses and with objects that reflected his dark humor. In 1978, the murder of a 15-year-old boy named Robert Piest led to Gacy's capture and arrest. During his trial, grisly details of his crimes were revealed and the remains of his victims were found on his property. He was convicted of multiple counts of murder and sentenced to the death penalty. John Wayne Gacy was executed by lethal injection on May 10, 1994. His case left a deep mark on the public conscience, due to the perversity of his crimes and his apparent double life as a respectable member of the community, which brought to light I reveal the terror that can be hidden behind a deceptive appearance. Number 7. Ted Bundy was one of the most notorious serial killers in American history. He was born on November 24, 1946 in Burlington, Vermont. Throughout the 1970s, he committed a series of brutal murders that earned him his reputation as a ruthless predator. Bundy murdered many young women in several states, including Washington, Oregon, Colorado, and Florida. Its confirmed victims number 36, although some reports suggest the number could be much higher. The way Bundy operated was by deceiving and seducing his victims. He used his attractive appearance and charm to gain their trust. He often posed as a person in need of help, such as a man with a cast on his arm or a bandage on his leg. Once he got the women close enough, he would violently attack them, beating them and strangling them to death. Bundy had a preference for young women with long, dark hair, usually similar in appearance. He used manipulative tactics to lure his victims and then subjected them to torture, sexual abuse and mutilation. In addition, he carried out acts of necrophilia with the bodies of some of his victims. He was arrested in 1975 and faced several trials in which he pleaded guilty to multiple counts of murder. Bundy managed to escape custody on 2 occasions, allowing him to continue committing more murders before he was finally recaptured. In 1979, he was sentenced to death for his crimes in Florida. During his time on death row, Bundy confessed details about some of his murders and offered information about other unsolved cases. He was executed by electric chair on January 24, 1989. Ted Bundy's evil lay in his ability to hide his true nature behind a charming and seemingly harmless facade. His crimes and manipulative tactics have left a lasting mark on the history of crime. Number 6. Gary Ridgway, known as the Green River Killer, was an American serial killer responsible for a series of brutal murders in the Seattle, Washington area. He was born on February 18, 1949 in Salt Lake City, Utah. Ridgway carried out his crimes over an extensive period of time, from the early 1980s until his capture in 2001. He primarily targeted young women and prostitutes, whom he murdered and then abandoned in areas near the Green River. These victims were often strangled or suffocated. Ridgway confessed to having murdered more than 70 women during his years of activity, but authorities were only able to confirm the identity of 49 of them. However, it is suspected that the real number of victims could be much higher. Ridgway had a clear preference for women in vulnerable situations, such as prostitutes or young people with drug problems. He took advantage of their vulnerability and lured them by offering money or other promises. After committing the murders, he sometimes returned to the bodies to perform acts of necrophilia. Ridgway's evil is evident in the cruelty with which he treated his victims and the apparent lack of empathy. He was a ruthless and calculating predator, who stalked his victims and murdered them mercilessly. Ridgway managed to evade capture for many years due to his ability to avoid suspicion and conceal his true identity. However, in 2001 he was arrested and convicted of several counts of murder. To avoid the death penalty, he agreed to cooperate with authorities and provided valuable information about the location of the victims and the details of their crimes. He was convicted of 49 murders in 2003 and is currently serving a life sentence in the Washington State Penitentiary. Gary Ridgway's life is a grim reminder of human evil and the devastating impact it can have on society. Number 5. Andrei Chikatilo, also known as the Butcher of Rostov, was an infamous Soviet serial killer. He was born on October 16, 1936 in Yabloknoy, Soviet Union, and committed a series of brutal murders over a period of more than a decade. Chikatilo's criminal activity began in 1978 and continued until his arrest in 1990. During that time, he murdered at least 56 confirmed people, mostly women and children, although it is suspected that the actual number of victims could be even higher. The way Chikatilo carried out his murders was extremely violent and sexually sadistic. Their victims were lured with promises of employment, money, or sexual favors. Once he had them under his control, he subjected them to physical and sexual torture before finally murdering them. Their methods included strangulation, stabbing, mutilation, and cannibalism. Chikatilo had a preference for women and children, especially adolescents. He looked for his victims at train stations, bus stops, and other public places. He was known for biting and tearing off body parts of his victims during attacks, which became one of his signature sadistic fetishes. His evil extended beyond murder, as Chikatilo also had a history of sexual abuse and acts of cruelty towards animals from an early age. These problematic behaviors and his antisocial personality disorder manifested chillingly in his actions as a serial killer. Chikatilo was arrested in 1990 and was subsequently convicted of multiple counts of murder and sexual abuse. During his trial, graphic details of his crimes were revealed and compelling evidence was presented against him. He was sentenced to death and executed by shooting him in the back of the head on February 14, 1994. The life of Andrei Chikatilo is a grim testimony to human depravity and the horror that a serial killer can inflict. Number 4. Pedro Rodrigues Filho, known as Pedrinho the Murderer, or the Son of Crime, was a Brazilian serial killer who carried out a series of atrocious crimes over several decades. He was born on June 17, 1954 in Santa Rita do Sapucaí, Brazil. Filho's criminal activity spanned from the 1960s to the 2000s. During this period, he committed at least 71 confirmed murders, although it is suspected that the real number could be higher than 100. His victims included criminals, rival murderers, and law enforcement officers. The way Filho murdered was extremely violent and brutal. He used a variety of methods, including knives, firearms, and forceful blows. He also committed acts of torture and mutilation on his victims. His ferocity and lack of remorse were notorious, and he often exhibited a disturbing coldness after committing crimes. Filho had a preference for eliminating those he considered a threat or who had offended his family. His history of violence began when he was young, killing his first victim at the age of 14. He continued to murder while in prison, where he retaliated against other inmates and was responsible for several more deaths. Although no specific details are known about Filho's fetishes or sexual preferences, his penchant for extreme violence and his lack of empathy toward his victims reflect a deep psychological disturbance. In 1973, Filho was sentenced to more than 128 years in prison for multiple counts of murder and other related crimes. However, due to Brazilian law that limits the maximum length of a prison sentence to 30 years, he spent only 34 years behind bars. He was released in 2007 and lived under restricted supervision. On March 5, 2023, at the age of 68, Pedrinho was murdered in Mogi das Cruzes, São Paulo metropolitan region, in front of his residence, around 10 in the morning. According to preliminary investigations, 2 hooded men got out of a car and shot Pedrinho 6 times. Number 3. Pedro Alonso Lopez, known as the Monster of the Andes, is an infamous Colombian serial killer who committed a series of terrible crimes in South America. He was born on October 8, 1948 in Santa Isabel, Colombia. Lopez's criminal activity began in the 1960s and extended until his capture in 1980. During that time, he murdered 110 confirmed girls and adolescents, although the number of victims is estimated at 200. Lopez selected his victims from among the most vulnerable girls, mostly destitute or from poor families. He lured them with gifts, money, or promises of food before taking them to isolated places, such as abandoned buildings or rural areas, where he raped and murdered them. The way Lopez carried out his murders was extremely violent. He strangled his victims with his bare hands or using ropes, and sometimes used other lethal methods such as forceful blows. After committing the murders, he often buried the bodies in shallow graves. Lopez had a specific preference for girls between the ages of 9 and 12. It has also been reported that he performed acts of necrophilia on the corpses of some of his victims, indicating deviant and disturbing sexual behavior. In 1980, Lopez was arrested in Ecuador after a failed attempt to kidnap a 9-year-old girl. He was imprisoned until 1994 and was handed over to the Colombian authorities for an extradition request, where he was confined in a psychiatric hospital. Years later, in 1998, he was declared healthy and released. According to a documentary on the ANE channel BIO, a search, location, and arrest request has been issued to Interpol since 2002. The last time he was seen was on September 22, 1999, when he appeared at the National Registry Office of Bogotá to claim his new citizenship card. Since then, his whereabouts have been unknown. Number 2. Luis Alfredo Garavito, known as the Beast or the Monster of Genoa, was one of the most prolific and ruthless serial killers in the history of Colombia and the entire world. He was born on January 25, 1957 in Genova, Quindío, Colombia. Garavito's criminal activity unfolded over a period of approximately 5 years, from 1992 until his arrest in 1999. During that time, he brutally murdered more than 193 children and adolescents, although the actual number of victims could be even higher, reaching up to the terrifying number of 300 victims. The way Garavito murdered was extremely violent and sadistic. He targeted disadvantaged young people, mostly street children, whom he attracted by offering them money, food, or gifts. Once he had the victims under his control, he would subject them to prolonged torture and sexual abuse before finally murdering them. He used various methods, such as suffocation, strangulation, and mutilation. Garavito had a preference for male children and adolescents, especially those who were vulnerable and in situations of abandonment. His crimes reflected a pattern of predation and exploitation, and some reports suggest that he carried out acts of necrophilia with the bodies of his victims. Garavito's evil is evident in the extent and cruelty of his crimes, as well as the apparent lack of remorse for his actions. During his arrest and trial, he provided detailed information about the location of his victims' bodies, displaying a disturbing coldness in recalling and describing the crimes committed. In 1999, Garavito was convicted of multiple counts of murder and sexual abuse. Due to his cooperation in locating his victims' graves, his sentence was reduced to 22 years in prison, the maximum sentence allowed in Colombia at the time. On October 12, 2023, the Colombian Prison Authority confirmed that Garavito died in a hospital in Valledupar at the age of 66, due to the cancer he suffered from in one eye and leukemia. The life of Luis Alfredo Garavito is a dark reminder of human evil and the horror that a serial killer can inflict. His numerous victims and his atrocious crimes have left a deep scar in Colombian society and in the collective conscience. Number 1. Harold Shipman, also known as Dr. Doom, was a British doctor and one of the most notorious serial killers in the history of the United Kingdom. He was born on January 14, 1946 in Nottingham, England. Shipman's criminal activity unfolded over several decades, from the late 1970s until his arrest in 1998. During that time, it is estimated that he murdered at least 218 patients, although some reports suggest the actual number could exceed 400 victims. The way Shipman carried out his murders was through the administration of lethal doses of opioids, especially the drug known as medicinal heroin. As a doctor, he had access to these medications and used them to sedate his patients before causing a fatal overdose. Shipman took advantage of the trust and authority that his profession gave him to commit his crimes. His victims were primarily elderly people, often women, who relied on him for medical care in their homes. Shipman took advantage of these home visits to inject them with lethal doses, hiding his actions under the guise of natural deaths. Shipman is believed to have murdered out of a combination of motivations, including a quest for power and control, a desire to avoid discovery in medical malpractice cases, and possibly a perverse satisfaction in causing the deaths of his patients. Shipman was arrested in 1998 after an investigation revealed suspicious patterns in his history of patient deaths. He was convicted of murder charges in 2000 and sentenced to 15 life sentences. In January 2004, he was found dead in his cell at Wakefield Prison, apparently from suicide. Harold Shipman's life is a chilling example of how a doctor can use his position of trust to commit atrocities. His multiple murders and betrayal of his Hippocratic oath have left an indelible mark on the criminal history of the United Kingdom, making him the most terrifying and prolific serial killer of all humanity. If you liked the video, please like and subscribe to the channel, so we can bring you more of history's finest tops from around the world.